and welcome back to Franklin Covey's twice weekly podcast on Leadership with Scott Miller. That's me. I'm your host twice weekly on Tuesdays and Fridays, where I've had the privilege now for nearly 7 years and almost 500 episodes to have conversations with many of the most influential people of our lifetime. They often join as entrepreneurs, solopreneurs, CEOs, leaders at all levels, scientists, academics, artists, philanthropists, people that have done something remarkable, in many cases discovered something along the way that can help each of you become a better leader. This podcast, of course, is sponsored by the FranklinCovey Company, known as the world's most trusted leadership firm, founded in part by Stephen Covey, the author of the seminal book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Our guest today is Melinda French Gates. You, of course, know her as a renowned philanthropist and investor in people and solutions through, of course, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Her new book is out called The Next Day. The tagline is Transitions, you've had a few, Change and Moving Forward. Melinda French Gates, welcome to On Leadership.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
Great to have you here, Melinda. I don't know that you need an introduction beyond what I have done. Of course, everyone knows you and the philanthropy that you and your former husband and Warren Buffett and others have put together to have remarkable impact on humanity, where you have helped people and their families and their life-saving vaccinations and work is well documented. I'd love to have us start and say you've spent the last 30 plus years very much in the public eye. Can you update our listeners and viewers on where your current passions are focused, including your philanthropy?
Thanks. Yes, well, I'm really focused these days on women and making sure we reach equality in society and making sure that women have their full power. And so I don't think it's news to anybody that I left the Gates Foundation last year in June, and I made $1 billion commitment about women through a company I run called Pivotal Ventures. And that $1 billion commitment is to really further women in society. Because what I know to be true is that when women are healthy, have their voice, their decision-making and full decision-making and resources, they change society for the better. And I believe we need to support more women in getting there.
Melinda, your new book is titled The Next Day. It's an extremely vulnerable review of your life. I learned a lot about you in terms of how you were raised, where you went to school, how you chose certain career paths and education. And a recurring theme in the book is the role that your father played in your life, not just your early life, but later life as well, the advice he gave you, the lessons you learned from him. Would you pick a couple of ubiquitous lessons that your father taught you, but you think are relevant and replicable in everybody's lives that are listening and watching today?
Sure. So I was really fortunate to grow up in a household with very loving parents, both my mom and my dad, who told us we could be anybody we wanted to be in society. And the one requirement they had is that we would go to college and they would figure out how to pay for it so we'd come out debt-free. And the thing that my parents did for me, and my father, I think in particular, that I think really affected me because I was a girl, is he believed in me every single step of the way. And so I use an analogy in the book from Ram Dass called the big wave and the small wave. The big wave is the two waves are coming towards the shore, and the big wave is thinking it's going to die. And the small wave says, no, you're not. It's okay. In the waves, as they crash to the shore, what the small wave can see is a perspective on the big wave, that they're just water and they're just going to transform into something different. My father always played that role for me. He believed that my sister and I could be good in science and math, and guess what? We were. He believed that we needed to have great teachers, and he made sure we were in schools where we did. He advocated for me at key times. He even said to me one summer, I was walking with my parents around a part of Dallas, Texas, where I grew up, and he said, it was an IBM building, he said, Melinda, you should paste your resume on the door. They should want to hire you. And so he could see who I was becoming and where I was going even before I could myself. And having a father's belief in me, especially when I got to hard times in life, just really kept me going.
If I'm not mistaken, in the book, you talk about a conversation you had with former First Lady Michelle Obama and some lessons I think that she even had learned from her mother, who I think recently passed. Can you recap part of that? Because I had to stop in the book. My wife and I, Stephanie, are the parents of 3 young boys, 10, 13, and 14. You know what that's like, because you had some similar ages clustered around it. My wife just wants one woman in the house because our dog is even a boy. She's like, I just need a woman in my life. Would you maybe recap some of the insights that you took away from First Lady Michelle Obama and her mother about parenting? Because much of this book actually is also a parenting book.
Yes, because you learn a lot when you're parenting young children and children, even my young adult children. So my adult children are now 23, 26, and 29, girl, boy, girl. And if you are purposeful about your parenting and reflective along the way about what the mistakes you made, how you want to raise your children, then I think you raise your children in a good way, a sound way. And so one of the things that deeply impacted me too, and Michelle said it to me in this video series that we were doing, she said that her mother, Mary Robinson, taught her that you're not raising little friends, you're raising your girls, in her case, her 2 young girls, to become independent young women in the world. And your job as a mother is to give them all the tools they need, make them resilient, help them along the way, but to give them the tools they need to launch as independent adults. And so one of the specific examples Michelle uses in the book is about boundaries. And I have to say, I had reflected on this a lot in my parenting, because, it's hard to set boundaries with kids and then open the guardrails. But example she uses is, she says, I would have loved to have my girls sleep in bed with me much, much longer than they did at an older age, right? But she said that would have been selfish. That would have been, for me, what they needed to do was to learn how to self-regulate, self-soothe, and have a good bedtime routine. And I thought that is a perfect example, because our job is to launch our kids into the world so they can become who they're meant to be.
That passage kind of stopped me in my tracks, because there's nothing we've liked more than to have our boys come and snuggle with us or sleep with us, age appropriate. And I had to reflect on that. It was great advice. You talk about this concept in the book called good enough parenting. You gave me permission to kind of lower my frequency and relax a little bit. Who knew that I was going to get great parenting advice from Melinda French Gates? But I did, and thank you for that. And so will all the readers as well. Talk about what it means to have good enough parenting and the impact that had on you when you sort of embraced that mindset.
Yes, I wish I had learned that mindset much, much earlier. It wasn't until one of my children was in middle school that I learned it. And I think, at least for me, and I've heard this from many women in society in particular, that, we have these ideals of perfectionism in our head. Sometimes they're from society, sometimes they're from our family growing up, sometimes they're from other people who put these things on us. There is no such thing as a perfect parent. There just isn't. What does a perfect parent look like? And once you embrace that you are imperfect, but you're doing your best job, and you're gonna make mistakes along the way. My gosh, I've made mistakes, and I've had to apologize in the moment to my kids, or later. They've had to apologize to me when they got, hot-tempered, let's say. If you embrace that you're a good enough parent for your child, I think you put the temperature down on yourself, and you're allowed to be more who you are. And so for one thing, once I finally learned to drop some of that perfectionism, and I did make some mistakes parenting where I didn't open the guardrails soon enough, or I put a boundary too tight on one of my children, I could also then teach them rupture and repair, which is, I made a mistake here. I need to own up to it, have responsibility, but I can repair with you. That is also a great thing for children to learn as they become young adults and then adults in the world, is that we all have rupture and repair in relationships, friendships, intimate partnerships, business relationships, and those are important lessons.
Melinda, this is an interesting concept, rupture and repair. Where did you learn that?
I learned that from a good friend watching her parent her two children. And we were on a trip together with our kids, and I made a mistake, I felt, in my parenting. And I just felt terrible about it with my youngest daughter. And she could see I was sort of beating myself up over it. And she said, well, okay, maybe you made a mistake, but what about rupture and repair? You and your child will learn something, through this rupture and repair. Just use that teaching with them. And gosh, when I learned that concept, it was so helpful because every healthy relationship, whether it's a friendship, an intimate relationship, a work relationship, you have rupture and repair. And then I realized I also needed to teach my children about unhealthy relationships because in those you have rupture, repair, and release. Because even if you have a toxic, say, employee in the workplace, sometimes you rupture with them, you might repair enough so you're not holding on to it and so they can go off on a new path, but you do release them, right? And so learning healthy relationships and teaching that in parenting and in organizations and unhealthy, those are both really, really important.
In fact, there's a passage in the book about that exact scenario with a toxic employee that you and, at the time, Bill were not necessarily aligned with. It's a fascinating example of how to deal with situations like that. Your book, Melinda, is a very normal account of your life, the lessons you've learned as a spouse, a parent, a friend, a professional, a philanthropist. But you've led anything but a normal life, in the last, 3 decades. Take a moment to explain, how have you managed to keep yourself grounded in abnormal circumstances? What have you done to make sure that you protect yourself, your children, stay tethered to reality, understand what's going on, choose your friends carefully? What advice would you give us there?
Yeah, I am totally cognizant of the fact that I've lived a life that, of incredible privilege. But I grew up in a middle-class family with really good values. And I can constantly go back and use that as a touch point. What did my parents do well? What do I wish they had done differently? How do I use that even in the midst of a large life to raise my children? I'm lucky enough to have 3 siblings, an older sister and 2 younger brothers. And they are truth tellers for me. And, especially my 2 younger brothers, they'll call me on things. If I get too full of myself, they'll be like, oh, come on, And, but I could also watch them raise their children and see how are they doing it. And I've cultivated on purpose a group of friends. I talk about my walking group in this book. Where I could show up on Monday mornings and be very real about what has happened over the weekend or in the last week. We'd keep in touch during the week, but we could share with one another our deep faults, the things we thought we'd done well, the things we were excited about. And I was lucky with those 3 friends. They were also all older than me. So they would talk about their parenting and I could watch and pull from that. And I had in my head, which is for my children, which is not undifferent than how I manage an organization. Where do I want them to go? I want them to be their best selves and live the lives that they're meant to live, whatever that is. I don't know what that is, but how do I set them on that path in the values I give them and the way I parent them? And that's much like an organization. You set the values from the top you want, and you help the organization set the strategies, but then you keep not parenting, but managing along the way and keep them on that track. And if you have things that are unhealthy or people that come around you, then you push those out of your orbit so that you do keep living those values.
I'm guessing you've matured into that wisdom some through therapy as well. You talk about the role therapy has played in your life, including, most recently, now that you're single, including some of the misconceptions you had going into therapy. Would you share a bit about that? And then we'll ask a final question and I'll let you go.
Sure. I originally went into therapy because of this toxic employee relationship. And I describe it in the book. I had a panic attack about it because Bill and I weren't completely aligned. And I thought, okay, I'll go in for, 5 or 6 sessions and that'll be done, right? And that just wasn't the case. That was just a symptom of a deeper problem. And as I started to unpack that and unpack my role in it, unpack, my co-founder's role in it, and at that time, my, marital partner, I started to just learn a lot and reflect on who I am, what I wanted in my values. Was I able to live those in this relationship and in this work environment? And so I have found therapy deeply helpful. It's a learning journey about oneself. And even you get to reflect on, how am I doing with my kids, or what am I worried about my kids, like when they're young, when they're older, and how do I then talk to them about that? Or as I have aging parents, how do I calm my own anxieties about that and support them, right? So it's a place to do that work and metabolize issues with another person, so then you go out and act in the world in the way that you want to.
This won't surprise you, but as I was reading that passage, I was thinking, how daunting to be Melinda Gates' therapist. And I thought, well, how does Melinda Gates find a therapist? Like, who does she have reference a therapist to her? So anyway, I spent a couple of minutes on that, and then I released you back to your privacy.
Thank you.
Melinda, in the book, you write extensively and very respectfully and vulnerably about your and Bill's divorce. Would you talk about the process of how you followed your inner voice? This is a term that I hear a lot about, and I don't know if I have one of those. How do you tap into it? What can you teach us about the gravity that comes with tapping into and listening and following your inner voice?
Well, the only reason I even included that chapter in the book was because I thought it would be disingenuous not to. People had known I'd gone through a divorce, and unfortunately, many people do go through one, and I wouldn't wish it on any family. But I learned some things along the way. I learned some things in therapy, from my friends, from what I call distilling my inner voice, from going to some wisdom from trusted leaders. I would go to my bookshelf, and I've written about many of those people, those authors in my book. But what I learned is that you have to listen to that deep place of knowing inside yourself. And it's not something that you're going to find when you're on, 10 business calls during the day and answering emails and texts and running in between, different activities with your kids. You have to take time in quiet. And in that time of quiet is when, if you really listen, your voice starts to whisper to you. And it's important to follow that. Otherwise, you can get off track of who you want to be and the values you want to live in the world. And so I have benefited enormously from being surrounded by a group of friends where we're all committed to trying to learn and distill and listen from our inner voice. And I think it has really helped me immeasurably in my life. And so I would encourage others to do it.
Melinda, this is a skill like learning to paint watercolors or scuba dive or give a keynote, because all of us are living in a world, maybe differently, where there's just an onslaught of choices and information, a barrage for your attention. Anything you might recommend as we end about how you find that quiet time as parents and professionals and trying to keep your life balanced in a crazy world with the politics going on, the trauma? I find that to be very aspirational, but very kind of unrealistic in my own life with 3 preteen boys, to find that discipline, that selflessness, to find that quiet space.
If you can realize that you're going to be a better parent and a better employee and a better spouse, if you find that time, you'll give it to yourself. And even if it only starts as 5 minutes a day, 10 minutes a day, it absolutely means putting your phone aside and not going to it. And so I think, I'll say for me, it's much easier to find it in the morning before my workday starts, or before I'm answering texts or my adult kids need me. But even before you carpool in the morning, and even before you make sure that your kids have actually rolled out of bed and had a little something to eat to get out the door, finding that time and finding a place that you enjoy doing it. Maybe it's in your home, maybe it's walking in the yard, maybe it's sitting with a particular author whose writings inspire you. 10 minutes. If you can, everybody can find 10 minutes in their day. If you can find 10 minutes of quiet, you'll probably start to enjoy it over time, and you'll just build on it. And it will benefit your life immensely.
like it or not, the world watches you carefully. I'm sure there are days when you wish that was not true, and other days that you are delighted when things are being recognized about your efforts, your focus, and your philanthropy. We wish you the best of success managing that heavy mantle that I think you take with great gravity and seriousness. Melinda French Gates, your current book is The Next Day: Transitions, Change, and Moving Forward. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
And we'll see you back here next week for a new conversation on leadership.